1? No? Project 2? Who's got questions? If there aren't any questions, I'll go back to my office. So your project is due Tuesday at midnight. And if you wait till Tuesday, 11:48, you won't make it. Because 40, 50 other people will be trying to upload. I will get 5 or 6 emails, please, 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 please. I was just a second over, I was a minute over. My answer will be this one. You're told. Yes, questions, yes.
I want to know about something about the augmented from an existing XML file.
About what?
The database can be augmented from an.
Oh, yeah, sure. So let's pull that up. So the database can be restored or augmented. What the heck does that mean? So my little demo yesterday restored the database. It read the whole thing back. What augmented means is that you may not be starting from a clean slate. You may have some stuff already in it. And what you want to do is you want to add any elements that are new to the database, add them in. Now, you could say, I'm gonna just whatever I get out of the file, I'll add them to the database, but that might be a mistake because something might have changed in the database since that file was written, and now you'll come and write the old stuff over the new change. Okay. So what that really is asking you to do is, as you're reading through the building these elements, just like I did, you compare that to the existing element in the database, and if it's the same key, all you got to do is compare the keys. If it's the same key, don't overwrite it. But if it's a different key, add, if that key doesn't exist in the database, add it. That's augmenting. Okay.
As we add a record, we will dump it to XML file, or at the end.
So you're obligated to demonstrate. You're obligated to supply your database. Your project has to have an XML file that can be loaded in the database that represents your project. So there's a record for every package in your project, and dependencies between packages are captured in the relationships. Okay, you're required to do that. So what you want to do, what I would do is when you get to demonstrating requirement, doesn't really matter. You could do this early and just say, I guess here's what I would do. So if I was doing it, I would do it this way. I would just make up tiny little, a database with 3 or 4 elements just to demonstrate all this stuff. But when you got to 11, then you say, creating a new database, loading it from my with my project details. So, you're demonstrating that. So again, the TAs put their hands behind their back, and they're going to type in compile because you have a compile.bat file, and they're going to type in run because you have a run.bat file. And if you need command line arguments, you supply them in the bat file. You don't expect the TA to figure out what command line to provide your project with. Okay, most of you probably won't have it, but if you do, you supply it in a run.bat file. And then the TA will type in compile and run. Now they will use the developer's command prompt. And for the compile.bat to work, you have to be using the developer's command prompt because it's got to be able to find the compilers and, you know, the build infrastructure, the Visual Studio stuff. And so the developer's command prompt has all of that on its path, but the normal command prompt, the standard command prompt, doesn't. So you should, when you build your batch files, you absolutely should test them. You know, we will get 3 or 4 projects that are missing parts because, you know, it was working where you went, and then you created a zip and you didn't get it all. You didn't select enough or something, and you submit it because you didn't test it. You're going to lose points. So, you know, we'll give you a chance to supply the missing stuff at the cost of that late fee. They send you an email. It gets to you the next day. It takes you another day to get it back. You know, you're losing points. So make sure you test your run.bat files and compile.bat files. And this, you know, this, if you go up to projects, and click on submissions, guess what? It tells you how to do that. The compile.bat file, all you need is dev environment, my solution, okay, rebuild / debug. And I do want you to say / rebuild. Don't say build. If the TAs see, any TAs here? If the TAs see a / build, not a rebuild, you lose a point. The reason is your exe may be infected by a virus, and if we run it, and we think when we run your compile.bat file that we built your file. But so our lab machines can get infected by your viruses because you didn't have, you know, any virus protection, or it wasn't up to date, or you're using your crummy whatever. Okay, so / rebuild, so it really does compile. And so that's all you need, you know. And as long as you're running in the developer command prompt and you're running the batch file from the same, you put the batch file in the same directory as your solution, which you should, then it'll work. Now, your run.bat file, your executable is down in the debug, so you probably want to, so Visual Studio, if you've got some relative directories in your project, where you're going to write the XML file and where you're going to read it from, but wherever, when Visual Studio runs, the current working directory is that debug folder. If you, in your run.bat file, you say cd debug, okay, you get yourself down where the executable is, so you've changed the current working directory to where all the paths will work. But you can say /debug / myproject.exe, and all the paths will be wrong. The relative paths will expand to the wrong thing because your current working directory is the project path. So what you want to do is you want to cd down into the directory where the exe is. You know, does that make sense, dude? Yeah. Yes.
Still for the augmentation. So if for the element has.
So again, what I would do, what I think you should do is when you're reading that file, if that key already exists in the database, you don't add it to the database, because what's in the database may well be more recent than what was in the file. Almost certainly is. You know, it's either the same or more recent, so don't overwrite it. So all you're doing is, as you're pulling you pull the key out, and if it's already in the database, then you just go around and get the next key, and you know. Yes.
I'm not sure if I'm missing something, but regex will be used for comparison of strings, right? And our payload is a template. So how would we introduce this?
How would you? I'm leaving that up to you. as I've said about 18 times, I'm leaving that up to you. Gotta have some design. Now, we've talked about, one way to start. I'm not gonna tell you any of the details, but one way to start is you can make your conditions a template class, templatized on the payload parameter, okay? And you can make your payload type have some functions to help a query work. Okay. And now, if you've made a template type T select of T, so you've made a template member, the query class doesn't need to be templatized, but that member, if you've made that template member, now I can put in whatever lambda I need to call those functions in my template payload to give me whatever information I need. Okay? That's why that stuff was there. I mean, let's look at this. Nine. Shall implement a payload type that contains a string, which for project 2 will be the path of a file in the repository. Payload type shall also contain a standard vector of strings, which are categories, blah, 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 blah. 2 points for requirement 9. Let's suppose you had in your payload a simple string and nothing else. You didn't provide categories. You would lose 1 point. So, if you're getting all bent around the axle trying to figure, you're not making much progress and you're spinning your wheels, you can elect it. I'm going to submit it with a simple string. I know how to do that. Okay. The only issue with that is when you get to project 2, you got to figure it out. You got to figure it out either now or when you get to project 2, because project 2 is going to need that. That's why it's there. But what I said, if you think about it a little bit, there's a good path. Yes, Harika. My old ears are so bad, I've got to come to you. All right, is this a query question or is it a persistence question? So you don't really have a question about how to persist. But what? Sharding, what, yeah, so okay. So Harika's question has to do with sharding. So the idea of sharding is that when you persist, what you're really doing is persisting a set of records defined by a key set. Now, by default, perhaps you're going to persist the whole database. But if to do sharding, you simply make a query, you get some reduced set of keys, and now you persist those keys, doing exactly what I did here, only now instead of taking the database, you're taking the query and getting its keys. And, okay, I mean you have to have the database to get the values, but you're basically what you're doing is exactly what I did, but now you're saying is this key in the query, or something like that. Did that answer your question? So sharding means that I'm going to write an XML file that contains all the records that result from some query, that are matching some query. and you do it just like I did, but now not with a whole database, just with that key set. Okay? What do you need when you persist? You need a key, and you need a value, and the value is just a DB element, okay? So if you got these keys from the query, you can take the key, go to your database, and get the value, write that into your XML. Get the next key out of your query. Go to the database and get the value. Write that into your query, into your XML. Make sense?
I had something which I have database. I want to restore from the file XML. Not getting the key.
Well, so, I'm not quite sure what you're worried about yet, but, so if I've made it, let's suppose that I have started something out. Now I make a change to the database, so the value, I don't add a new key, but I change the value of one of the existing keys, or maybe even add a new key. Okay, when I read that file back, because the key already is in the database, I don't overwrite it. I skip it, go to the next key. So what I'm really doing by augmenting is just supplying key and value only if that key doesn't exist in the database. Otherwise, I do nothing. So I'm not overwriting the newer stuff. All of that wasn't laid out in gory detail. You can elect to do some different process, but if you do, I would make it really clear what you're trying to do. What the requirement demands of you is that database can be restored or augmented. So, it doesn't really tell you what you're going to do. If you overwrote newer data with the older data from the file, that still meets the requirement, and you couldn't lose a point. You might, if the PA is grading it, or I see it, we'd probably subtract a design point because you're overwriting newer data with older data, but, chances are we wouldn't even see it. But it's just as easy to do it the way I just described as it is to do it any other way. So, right? That's a kind of a policy you're supplying. You're saying, here's what I'm going to do. If you wanted to, in the for the augmentation, it's just a tiny little in the persistence mechanism, you could supply an option when you're restoring to either overwrite everything or only add new things, and it works. You do it either way. Yes.
It could check the timestamp.
I don't. That's not a reliable. I mean, you can, but what does that really mean? Okay, I can have something that I would accept checking the timestamp, but I think my own reaction is that would be a useful option to supply, but it's Friday morning, it's due Tuesday night. There's no obligation to cover absolutely every possible, issue. You just have to meet the requirements. Okay. So, it's a reasonable thing to do, Mikhail, is to check the timestamp and overwrite the value if the timestamp was newer in the database than it was, newer in the file than it was in the database. I don't think that would happen very often.
So if I have XML file of my original
I perform addition or deletion, so I have a new key in the database. So after that, if I show the augmented database, if that satisfies addition of a new key.
I think to demonstrate augmentation, a good way to do that would be to shard out part of the database, so you have just a partial guy. And now you augment it from the full database file and show what's happening. And again, you don't want to do this with a database that has 73 members, you know. We don't want 30 pages of output. Do it with a database that has 4 members or 5 members or something like that. Okay. Marika, did I answer your question? You're sitting there like I didn't really still answer it. Did I answer it? Sure. You're not just saying that because you don't want to deal with my hard of hearing. Here. Okay. Yes. So there's a question over here, and then I'll get to you.
Do we need to support a query for the payload?
Yes.
But you didn't say that we should. You just say the metadata. You mean that the payload belongs to the metadata?
No, it doesn't.
So why should we support a query for the payload? You just say that.
Just hang on a minute. Let me check. Because if I didn't demand it, that's an oversight on my part. So I'll tell you what we're going to do. I won't change the requirement if I didn't say it, but I'll take off a design point if you don't. Okay? Let me say that loud and clear. Okay. It should have been in the requirements. If I didn't put it in the requirements, it's because it's an oversight on my part. Okay. So we won't take if it isn't there, but I'm going to look for here for a minute. So shall implement a payload type contains a string blah blah path. Payload type shall contain blah 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 blah. The repository, the key will be a file name, so the combination of key and payload will provide the details about a file stored in the repository. How could you provide the details if you can't make a query on that payload? If you put it in the database and you don't have a query for it, how can you show those? Okay. Will provide details. Payload will provide details about a file stored in the repository. Okay. So I think I didn't say it exactly, but close enough. So if you don't do it, we'll take off the phone. Other question? You had a question.
It's a good idea to have an XML some values. Read it and
You
populate
must.
your database.
You must, because you have to satisfy requirement 11.
Okay, so reading it and populating your database and then performing the demonstrations after
Well-
writing the result back to the.
What I would do is I wouldn't use this to do that. I would make up a simple little test database. You know, maybe your keys are test 1, test 2, test 3, test 4, something. You know, it doesn't matter, but some simple, small database. But then you're manufacturing them, and it doesn't mean that you have those stored as XML. You can. It's one perfectly good way to do it. You could store them as XML, but you could just generate them on the fly for your testing. Okay, and then but when you get down to demonstrating requirement 11, I'm reading the XML file from this path, and here's my database. So, and you should say, here's the path, so the TA can go, or better yet, you display, you read out the file, here's the XML file. Yes.
So we don't have to read the XML file and perform all the requirements, right? So we can just have a database, perform all the operations, and then load.
So, since you have to be able to populate the database from an XML file, if you can demonstrate you meet all the requirements with the database with it populated with something, it doesn't matter whether that's file. You could do it with that file. but that demonstrates that it's doable.
So is it fine, like if we use the basic prototype which you have given to demonstrate all the requirements and
No,
then,
because that won't demonstrate all the requirements.
no, the basic database that you have provided?
Won't demonstrate all the requirements. It doesn't meet all the requirements. I would absolutely not, what does my database do? Satisfies that requirement. Doesn't satisfy this requirement, doesn't satisfy this requirement, doesn't satisfy this requirement, doesn't satisfy this
No,
requirement.
we'll perform operations on, like we'll add more to it.
Yes.
Yes. And then
I
we
hope
can,
you already have. It is
Yes.
now Friday morning. Okay.
yes, yes.
Yeah, okay.
And then after performing more operations on it, we can load that database into a file. That will satisfy the requirement 8, right?
You have to be able to persist that, so that doesn't completely. You have to be able to persist it, and then you have to be able to restore it and augment it. Those are two different things. Restoring says, I'm going to create a new database from those, and that new database will have all of those contents. Augmenting means I have a database with some stuff in it already, and anything in that file that isn't in the database, I add to the database.
For the requirement 9, so implement a payload type that contains original payload value, string, and a vector of string. So one of the detailed implementation is stuck in the visual code analyzer complaint about this added use.
Yeah. The analyzer will complain about public data, but if you haven't passed that around, my intent is that it's perfectly reasonable to use a struct internally as long as clients don't have to deal with that struct. When you start passing, structs out to the clients that they tinker with, okay, then you're making that data public. But if it's just an internal implementation, that's fine. But you wouldn't lose points for that. But if that, I would probably make it a class, not a struct. My little demo, I just did a quick struct, but right, that's what I drew on the board. Okay, but you can make it a class, but you won't be. The analyzer will complain about public data, and struct's data is public, okay, unless you made it private. But as long as that doesn't appear in the interfaces of any of the classes you use, that struct doesn't appear. It's just an internal implementation, it's fine, not a problem.
And if we query this column or this this is column like payload string, we use separate queries, like we query payload, query category with a function.
Maybe not.
But this is not meet the last sentence of the requirement 9. The combination of payload will provide details of the file in the repository. The payload we return now is separate payload and category. They are separate.
No, the category, the payload is, by that definition, the payload is a string that will eventually, in Project 2, hold the path to the file and this vector of categories. That is the payload. String plus categories is the payload.
How can we demonstrate?
So the combination of, so the payload type, so shall implement a payload type that contains a string. The payload type shall also contain a standard vector of string. That's the payload. The string and the standard vector of strings.
How can we demonstrate this? How can we demonstrate that we combine the string and the string in a payload type?
You don't really have to. You have to demonstrate that your database can capture those and, you know, capture the categories and this other string, which will be the path. You're going to demonstrate the metadata processing in this, you know, requirement 6. So that's really all you need. You don't have to say, you know, here it is.
Or should we need to demonstrate that we can capture a combination of a string and a vector of string as a payload type?
Yeah, but you know, I mean, yes, you have to demonstrate that, but it does. You don't have to stick it in your face and say, "Here, look it. This is together." All you got to say is, "Here's a string. Oh, here's the categories. You're done." Okay. You don't really have to, you know. You know, the requirement says they got to be together. Okay. So if you really want to be precise, you demonstrate the string and you'd show the string and show the categories, and then your output would say, if you look at line blah 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 in package blah blah blah, you will see that the payload consists of these 2 parts. Okay? That would absolutely nail the requirement.
One more question.
Sure.
So, for the project code grid sheet, there is in the style part, there is a common indenting requirement that shows we should not use the comments in the function.
Yeah.
And should we?
So what that means is, you know, ideally your functions have no comments because they're so clear they don't need them. But should you have some tricky little part, there you should be provide a comment to help people understand this tricky little part of your code. But there are some people who take this, you know, overboard and say I equals I plus 1, incrementing index. That's a useless comment. Okay. So don't do that. But you know, we're not going to get really picky about that. But if you have a whole bunch of these, you know, incrementing counter, you know, setting counter to 0 in comments, you know, anytime the comment is identical to the code statement, you know, has no contributed value other than to repeat what's already in the code, it's a useless comment.
And besides, can we use std_out or other console output function to print messages in the function other than the executive test function?
You can, but that's easy to overdo. I do that sometimes,
so
especially
like,
for my demos.
Like say insert operation. If we insert invalid instance to the database, this will not call. But in my design, I don't want it to throw exception to cause the later operation fail.
Yeah.
I only want it to send a message. Notice the claims that your now operation is failed. So should I say out?
So what I would do is in that function that you don't want to throw an exception, I would return a bool that it either succeeds or not. And if it fails, printing out a little message to the, you know, but understand that when we write code, we don't want to really weld this code into a console application. Okay? And so if you always write, you know, you're conveying error messages via that, that makes your code less flexible because now it demands to be run in a console application if it's going to have decent error handling. So one very reasonable, what people normally do is throw an exception, but catch it, you know, and then print out a message But I think it's a good idea where you can, where it makes sense, where you don't lose any information, to not throw exception but return a bool value. But now in your code that's being demonstrated for the TAs, then you print out on the console. But so that's just the demo executive is writing that. So so all your parts are still nicely reusable parts, but you're achieving your objective of demonstrating to the TA what's going on. I have written a logger, and I haven't talked much about it, and partly because I'm not totally satisfied with the design. I will change it a little bit one of these days. But the logger allows you to select the level of the output you want to supply, and it selects what it writes to. It needs to write to a stream. That stream could be the console, but it also could be a string stream that now you could use in a GUI. So.
So should we change our STD cell into a STD like a S3?
Could, but hey, it's Friday morning and your project is due on, so I wouldn't go overboard with it. I think it's a good idea to use a flexible logger. And if you're interested in that, we can talk about it sometime. I can, if there's time, I can talk about it a little bit this morning, show you that works. Yes.
For the query about.
But if we don't get to it this morning, if you're interested, we can either look at it during the, my office hour, or I'll just take a little time in one of the classes and I'll talk about it a little bit.
For the query for the payload, we need to put the regular expression matching for the path and every element of the category.
You have to be able to query for that information.
For every element of the category.
You have to be able to query for that information. So, is this category, are you in this category? Or show me all your categories. Or do you not have that category? Maybe I want to display all the things that aren't in some category. But what your goal is not to write a trillion queries that cover every possible case. Your goal should be to write a flexible query mechanism so it's easy to do any of those things if you want to, and then you just demonstrate a little bit of it. Okay.
We need to do the regular expression of the
I'm having a
path.
hard time hearing, guys. So
All the path, for example, I need all the keys that has payload that the path capital with some.
a query might be, give me all the files that are in this category.
That's a payload is
That one demo would probably be fine. You demo, here's all the files that have this string in their payload. Here's all the files that have this category in their payload. And you want it to give you two different answers, so you very carefully set up a test so that one query will show this element and another query will show that element. So if you have one element that satisfies both queries, you haven't demonstrated that both queries work. We know that for example, maybe only your query for the path works. And now you take an element that has that path in some category, but only your query for the path works, and you run that query and say, see, I got both the path and the category, but you didn't. So your test has to be tight enough to show that. So what you really want to do is you want to have a one element that has a path you're going to query for, and a different element that has a category you're going to query for. Okay? When you're testing, you got to be clear that the test really does demonstrate what you say it does. You know, I could have a test that that really only checks the name, and I put in an element with a name and a path and a category, and I make the query for the name, show the result. I say, see, I'm getting the path and the category, but you didn't find that at all, you know, because your test is faulty, your test is too weak, as well as your query wasn't strong enough. Okay, so you gotta really demonstrate that you met the requirement.
A query should make sense. Query should make sense.
Your query needs to make sense. Your query needs to, you know, you have to have an element that isolates out what that one query is going to look for. Demonstrate you really did it. Yeah. And people are genius, you know, if I wasn't able to do that, meet that requirement, we'll do queries that make it look like I did. Okay, but, you know, we look for that sort of thing, we do. Other questions? Yes.
When
What's your
deleting,
name? Yeah.
move on to my Chinese.
Yeah, right. What's your Chinese name?
My first name is Tianyu. My last name is.
So your first name is
Tianyu, Tianyu.
Tianyu? Tianyu?
Yeah.
Tianyu.
Yeah.
Okay, and your last name is?
Qi.
Spell it for me.
QI.
QI. Oh, okay. So, Chi. Sort of?
Right. You got
So,
it.
Tianyu. Sort of. And I will never come anywhere that close again, but
That's fine.
Tianyu I can probably remember.
That's fine.
Okay.
So when we did remove an element from, if it is a child key of other element, will we remove this
Yes.
element?
You won't remove those elements that hold that as child, but you remove the child relationship.
So what I say is I remove this element, I remove the key and its corresponding metadata. And this element is a child key of another
Yes.
element. So if I remove this element, should I delete the child relationship of this child?
Yeah, so there's two things you can do. Either one does work. You can remove the child relationship for that removed key. That's perfectly correct. The other thing you can do is not remove it,
But this will
but
cause.
wait. You can not remove it, and then anytime you use that relationship, you check to see if it's in the database. If that key is in the database, and if it's not, you just ignore it. Or you remove it then. That's the best thing. So in that way, you know, so if you do it that second way, you didn't burn up the CPU cycles to go search around and find those relationships, but it's perfectly safe because anytime I use it, now I check to see if it's in the database, and if it isn't in the database, I remove it from that relationship and I don't do anything else.
How we demonstrate the second way?
I don't think you, so that's okay, that's a fair question. You say, gee, the TAs are gonna take off a point because so what I would do is when you delete that element, then on the console you write out, I've taken the option not to remove that relationship, but I will check. Now you do an operation that would require you to use that, and you say that has now been removed from the relationships. Okay? And that will be convincing. I think it's a good way to do it. That's probably the way I would do it. Perfectly correct to remove it. So if you've already, if you've removed it, that's fine, perfectly correct. I just think this is what I'm really doing is caching that operation. I'm saving that removal for when I really need it. Okay. Other questions? You guys are all ready. Fantastic. Not asking questions, you're all ready. Yeah. What's your name?
Fred.
Fred.
Yeah, I have a question about 11. We're supposed to, in 13, we provide a package diagram, but in 11, you talk about how the second
Yeah. I would expect they would match.
All right.
The diagram, I use Glyphy. And Glyphy, if you open Chrome and then go to the web store in Chrome, search on Glyphy, you'll find Glyphy. You got to be careful because I've been told that there are some malware fakes. So you want to make sure it's from Glyphy.com. But I looked, the last time I looked, I was told there were some malware fakes and I looked and I didn't find any. But I like the Glyphy tool, it works real well. And I'll be satisfied if you just hand draw it and then take a picture with your camera and paste that into a Word document and save it as a PDF. That'll work fine too. This is not a, if this were SMA, I'd be a little more, buffer modeling analysis, I'd be a little more particular about it. Glyphy is a really nice tool. It's worth using. I use Glyphy just to think about a design. I'll rough in a package diagram or a class diagram or something. Use it to think about the design. Other questions? A student came to me yesterday. With build problems. So in my little demo, the executive was just the test stub and DB core. Okay. But he had written an executive, which is he should. And it was compiling, but he was getting linker errors. Because it said, hey, I can't find the DB core. Hey, I can't find query. Hey, I can't find. And what that meant was that, and this is a little hard to demo here because of the way I set this up, but I had made date time a static library. And so I can just make a reference to it. DB core doesn't have to include the date time header file and CPP file. But if, I can just make a reference to it. But those references, unlike .NET, unlike C#, in C#, I can just make a reference to some other project and I get all that stuff. Because of reflection. When I make a reference, if the compiler needs that information, it just goes and does some reflection on the assembly that I've referenced and gets whatever information it needs, but C++ doesn't have reflection. So what that means is that if I didn't make this a static library, then in every everything that uses datetime, like DB core, I would have to add datetime.cpp. And if I do that, I come along and add datetime .h here, just so that, you know, I can quickly look at it. But you have to have the CPP files for everything that you're using if it isn't compiled into a static library. If it's compiled into a static library, I can make a reference to it, because the static library is acting like the metadata in a C# assembly that the compiler is inspecting. Now the compiler inspects the static library. Okay. And so the references to that work. But if I don't make something a static library, and I tend not to, you know, if there's some fairly small utility that I am using, and I'm pretty sure it's stable, I'm not going to change it, I'll make it as a static library, and I'll make a reference to it. But everything else, you have to, and what you do is, if I just come and add, so I could add this, so let me show you. Here's DB core, and this is going to compile. So let me first compile this datetime and build the datetime guide. Now I can build DB core, and it all works because I have a reference in DB core to datetime. Now let's change datetime so that it isn't a static library. So here I'm going to make this a executable. Okay. And now this won't. You know, in the properties for datetime, I have no test underscore datetime, because I didn't want that main to be compiled into the static library, because if it was, you're going to get that main along with your own main in a DB core or test executive or whatever. You'll have two mains and the linker will complain. So what this means is, because I said no test datetime, now this will fail to link, because the linker would say, hey, you don't have a main, so let's just endow it with a main. Okay. So now this will build successfully. Because it finds the main, because I did that. Now, what happens is DB core, you know, this reference now is, you know, maybe there's still a static library hanging around, so let me just remove that reference. So now DB core will fail to compile. Damn, there's lots of stuff I can't find. What's going on here? So, lots of stuff I can't find. But now, if I just go to DB core and I add existing item, and I come up here to datetime, and I add datetime.cpp and datetime.h, add, okay. Now this will build. Voila, okay. But I had to add, because now I changed this so this is no longer a static library. Okay, I had to add this datetime. It doesn't help me if I haven't built this as a static library. If I come to DB core references and I say add reference, you know, it'll let me check this, but if it isn't built as a static library, that'll fail. Okay, that won't substitute for having those in there. So, you know, you can do it either way. But what I'm saying is that now you come along with an executive and you need the services of DB core. You got to pound in. You have to add DB core to the executive project. dbcore.cpp and dbcore.h. And the same thing with the query. If you want to run the query from your test executive, you got to add those, okay? So once those, guys, could you keep it down? It's okay to, this is a help session, it's okay to talk, but just really quietly. You know, if that project is getting stable, I'm not making many changes to it, then I will typically make it I'll make it as a static library. I'll make a reference to that, and I'll remove those parts. So I don't have all those parts, you know, because it's now stable. I'm just using that resource. So, it's been on my agenda for a long time in my repository to supply header files and build static libraries, so you didn't have to load down the parts and build it. You could just, you know, download the static library and make a reference to it, and bang, you just use it. Away you go. But I haven't gotten to that. You know, that's been second priority, and I haven't gotten to any second priority things in the last 5 years. So, you know, you guys keep me so busy.
So why don't you just build other components as standalone project, like if we have query and
I typically do. I typically build them as standalone project and then
only build datetime and ML document as static library and as a
yeah, you can. That's what I'm saying. You know, you can. I don't tend to make static libraries until the parts are really stable, because then I've done forever, you know, rebuilding them. What happens is if they aren't stable, I have a static library, I make a change in it, and I forget to rebuild it, and now I made a change to that part, and now I'm running this, and I'm saying, I didn't get the change, what's going on? It's because I didn't rebuild the static library, and I'm using the old static library, even though it has new parts. Okay, so, yeah, whatever works for you is fine. I'm just explaining that if your process, you know, you have to either build something as a static library and make a reference to it, or include those parts in your project, because to build it, it has to have that information that's in those. Yes.
Why do you encourage to have a test stub for every package that we write?
Because if that package is useful, other people are going to want to use it, and they need to know, this is what I want. So they need to be able to build it, run it. Oh yeah, this does what I want. Or no, it doesn't really do what I want. Okay.
Do you suggest to have it in a query and test?
Absolutely, you'll lose a point if you don't. You are required to have test stubs. And, you know, the test stubs do two things. One is it helps you build successfully, because you should be adding a function, adding a test, run and build. Add another function, add a test, run and build. Add another function, add a test, run and build, add another test, run and build, add another test. It is a complicated function, okay? So that should be your process. If instead you type, already, all I got to do is test it, you're in for grief. Because bang, something happens. Where? I have no idea. It could be anywhere in this 4,000 lines of code. But if you keep it running and now add a little bit and run a test, if that test fails, you know exactly where it is, right there, the stuff I add. So that incremental development model is, I try really hard to make my projects complicated enough so that you cannot type it all up and then try to test it. I don't want that. You know, you can't do that with professional code. You can't succeed that way as a professional if that's what you do. You gotta develop incremental. Software is too darn complicated, you know. It's wonderful because it is. It's this interesting, you know, but it's also aggravating because it's complicated. Okay. That incremental development process is essential. Other questions?
most of the stuff we test execute.
Why do we use what?
Test.
Test package? Well, so I'm not sure if this is your question, but let me answer what I think might be your question. So here I am building this project, and I have an executive. Why would I build a separate test package? And I would. Why? You definitely could build all those tests into the executive. Okay. But if you have a separate test package, remember I did this DB provider, DB, because I had some tests that were not methods of a class. They were just global methods. And so to give them all the same database, I had to make this static database provider, and now each of them would declare it, and they would get that database just by declaring the static provider. Okay, but that's kind of clumsy. It's public data, not a great idea. If you make a test class and make the database part of the test class, then each test method gets access to that database. But no provider, all that's gone. And now my executive will just call functions on the test class. Okay. Make sense? You're not obligated to have a separate test executive, but I think it's a real good idea. Do I require you to? Oh, good for me. Okay, good. I'm glad I did. But that's the model. And so, you would expect that in your main, so I have an executive that starts up, creates a database and creates the query, blah, 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 blah. Or it might not even create the query, it might just create the database and then just create a test object and then start calling the methods on the test object. And now your executive main is small. You will lose points if your application main is too big. You do not lose points for large test stubs. We don't subtract from your score for large or complicated test stubs. But we will for the main that runs your program. So if you do all your testing in that main, then you're going to have to factor out a whole bunch of little functions to keep from having that main get too big. But the easy thing to do is just build a test class. Now you don't have to worry about refactoring. Just build a test class. The methods are doing the testing. I think that's a better design. I regret having done the provider. I just did that because I was in a hurry. I wanted to do that demo. It was Thursday night. I wanted to do the demo for you Friday morning. So instead of building a test class, I just made that provider just because I knew it would work. Okay. But had I to do it again, I would have started my demo a little earlier and I would have done a test class. Right, how are we doing here in the front row? Okay? Yes, you have a question. Good.
Updating the timestamp, the daytime.
Okay.
Because we are editing the metadata of the record.
Okay.
When we change, like, for example, we have changed the child relationship.
Yeah.
Do we also have to update the daytime?
Editing, you have to show that you can edit every part of the metadata. Let's look at the requirement. So tells you for editing of values, including the addition or deletion of relationships, editing text metadata, and replacing an existing values instance with a new instance. Editing of keys is forbidden. So what this means, when I say editing text metadata, you got to demonstrate you can edit any part of that metadata.
I mean,
Okay.
the requirement 12 is it says that the daytime instance recording the date and time that the
Yeah.
value that is written to the database. Because, for example, I'm overwriting my database, but I want to keep the original data. I haven't added anything about this record.
if you overwrite, you definitely should not keep the data. If you're overwriting a value in your database, so the record, the key value pair, if you're overwriting that in the database, you ought to overwrite everything, you know, if you're that, because that date time is for that record, and if you're gonna overwrite this, you don't wanna change the date time, would be the wrong thing to do.
Okay, so I don't want to change others. I haven't.
But for this editing, you're gonna need to demonstrate that you can edit it, you need to demonstrate that you can change the date time. That's simple. You know, just create a new datetime instance that's different. Datetimes, my datetime class, it was based on Chrono, and Chrono, what Chrono's model really is to describe time durations, really what Chrono does. And so my class makes it really easy because it's based on Chrono. You have a date time, and now you can add some duration to it, and then, you know, just use that as the new element, as the new date time. Okay. You can add a day. Or whatever.
When you say query payload, this payload means the payload requiring
Yes.
of every type.
So yeah, so you're gonna pick, so I've really required you to have a payload that has a string and a vector of categories, and you have to query that. You have to demonstrate. To meet the requirement fully, you have to demonstrate you can query that. You don't have to demonstrate that you could query other payload types. That would be cool to do that, but that could take a while. You know, hey, Tuesday night is coming fast. So my advice to you would be, if you're going to do that, make that the very last thing on your agenda. Yes. Okay.
So I tried to payload. So I have created operator overloading for that left arrow. I'm not able to.
I don't want to talk about payload. If you can ask your question in the context that it isn't a payload, I'll try to answer it.
I just want to operator overload that output stream. Double left arrow.
Oh, the insertion operator.
Yeah.
Okay, you saw how I did it in the for the abstract data type presentation. The same model. If you're gonna overload the insertion operator, the insertion operator accepts the stream by reference and that thing that you're gonna put out by reference and returns an O stream by reference. That is the insertion operator. That's what you gotta. Okay, so you do it just like, you know, it's the same idea as we did in the abstract data types. You know, if you want to send it to, you know, you can send it, you don't have to send it to C out, you can send it to an O stream. So it could be a file, it could be a string stream, it could be a C out, any of those things will work. Other questions? Yes?
I noticed your DB core.cpp to declare a global variable of DB provider.
Yeah, that's what I was just talking about here. I did that because I was in a hurry. I developed the demo on Thursday to present the next morning. And so I didn't have the time to do a test class. The right way to do it is with a test class, and the database is a member of the test class, and now every one of those member functions have access to the database. I had global test functions, just 3 little global test functions, and they needed to use the same database, and so I used that it's constrained global data because it is captured, but it is global, you know, and is not.
They are forbidden to use this global data over .cpp.
The only time you should ever have global data is if it's constant. I used that and I regret using it. I did it because I was in a hurry and I wanted to get the demo done for you so I could present it the next morning. Okay, that's why I used that static DB provider, but not a great idea. Okay.
But we can use a static global test function, right?
Well, you could use a global test function. Again, I wouldn't for that very reason, because if you use global test functions, then you're going to need to use providers like that to give it a consistent. If you want to have one database that this function works on, this function works on, this function works on, okay. If you have global, you're forced to use a static provider like I did. But if you make it a class, and it's not much longer to make a class, you make a class and make that database a member of the class, then each of those functions get access to it. Okay. So that's what I would do.
Does it mean that we should implement all the test functions in the test class, and each test sub in each package should call the function from test class?
No. So that's a good question. So guys, it's a really good question. What's your name?
Yang. Y-A-N-G.
No. So Young asked a really good question. He said, so are you saying that we should have a test class and that every test stub should call a function on that test class? And the answer is no. Here's why. Because when I'm first starting out, okay, I'm building stuff. I don't have much functionality. I don't really know what that test class should do yet, okay? And so what I want to do is I just want to make simple little tests that say, yeah, this is probably right, yeah, this is probably right, okay? And let me keep it working, keep moving on. But now, as I'm getting close to the end, now I want to make a good, repeatable, well-designed test. And so now I design a test class. I don't call that test class from my test stubs. I call it from the executive's main, where you're going to demonstrate stuff for the TAs, and where you'll demonstrate, for some user who wants to use your code, great way to do it. Okay. Good question. Other questions? In the left, in the corner back there, you. Have you been able to get TA help that you needed? I know you can't make the Tuesday session. Do you go to the Friday session that Amar runs?
Oh, no, actually, Amar finished.
Okay. Okay. So you didn't really need. You're okay. You're getting the help that you need. Is that true or false?
True.
Okay, good. Great. That's what I want to hear. Other questions? Yes.
So the query for that specific type of the payload should we also implement regular expressions?
Not necessarily. The regular expression was just I think implementing regular expressions for the path, for the string part would make sense. But I don't think it would for the categories, probably. I don't know, it might, but it's no harder to use the regular expression than not, once you figured out the way regular expressions work. By the way, you're not, unfortunately, the C++ standard library calls its regular expression matcher object, it calls it a regular expression. That isn't what I meant for you to pass. I didn't mean you to pass that regular expression matcher object. I meant for you to pass a regular expression string. So this is a string that uses the regular expression language, and now inside your matcher is comparing that string to, okay, that's.
So the query is.
But so here, for the payload, I think I would probably use a regular expression for the payload string, but I probably wouldn't for the categories, because, you might, no, not much harder.
Just like you give me a regular expression, so I give you.
Okay, so here's the deal. The TAs are not going to substitute, well, they might, but my mental model is they're not going to substitute regular expressions for your regular expressions, you know, because they could get some, you know. The regular expressions are a really nice way of allowing your users to be quite selective about what they want to see. Okay, so yes, I think it's a nice way to do it. It's not the only way to do it, and I didn't require that you use regular expressions. I just showed you that that's what I would do in my query. I think it's a nice way to do queries. So I would probably use it for the payload, but you know, the payload you gotta, you know, it's a little trickier because it's a template type, so it's gonna vary. And so, yeah, I can build a way that'll work for that one payload type as specified here, but is that gonna still be useful when there's some other payload type? Maybe not. And what I've tried to describe, I've hinted at least, is a way that you can provide a general mechanism that'll work. So. But all you have to demonstrate is for that particular.
I'm not sure if it is a right design approach or not, but I thought if in the conditions class we have new fields such as the path and the category, try to in the cascading operations, try to filter out my records with regards to the categories by giving those fields a regular expression.
Yeah, that's fine. Fine. Nothing wrong with it at all. There's quite a bit of flexibility in how you set those up. You know, I could imagine a query class kind of evolving a little bit as you know, I said, you know, we could have these select functions, but we might make specialized select functions that, you know, just to make it, you know, the language a little more obvious to a user what's going to happen when you do that. So, but you know, but what you say is fine. You know, we're going to look at each of these requirements. Each shall is something we look at. But we aren't going to nitpick you to death. We're not going to say it's got to be exactly like what's in Dr. Fawcett's head. It's not what we do. What we do is say, essentially what we do is we say, is there any way I can interpret this output as satisfying that requirement? If it is, check. Okay. But, you know, don't, you can take that to ridiculous extremes and, you know, we'll be reasonable about it. But, you know, professionally, you may well find yourself in situations where the customer or whoever is evaluating your test is very picky, very, very picky. You got to be exactly spot on, or they'll call you down and make you change your, you know. That isn't typical, but every now and then you get customers like that. But you know, we try to interpret things. If there's some slack, some, you know, different ways, we try to interpret it in your favor. Within reason, right, Fred? I think we're about done. Are we about done? We got 10 more minutes before I kick you out. I think we're done. Yes.
So for the clarify of the test class, we need to write the DB query and persistence provider in the test class.
I would not. The test class doesn't need a DB provider. The class needs a DB.
Yeah, DB.
It doesn't need a provider.
Yeah.
And the test class will use the queries, but the queries should not be part of the test class. Absolutely not.
So for each part of the project, where will their test function will be? Will this text functions their .cpp file, or they will in the test? They will in the test.
I think the way I would suggest doing it is I would have a separate package that had a test class that made, included all these parts that it needed, the query and the DB core and blah, 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 blah. I would make DB core a data member of that class, and I would have its methods create instances of queries, structure queries, and then display output. So, for each requirement, I'd have a method for, requirement 3, a method for requirement 4, a method for requirement 5, and maybe more than one method. And but the queries, the persistence, the DB core, none of those belong to the test. The test is simply using them. So what happens is your main in the executive that starts up this whole project. In that main, it'll create an instance of the test class calling its constructor, which gives it the DB. And so I think you should make a very rational design would be to pass the DB as non-const reference and make it a reference member of the test class. And then the methods just declare queries on it. So the test class includes the header file for the queries, includes the header file for the persistence, and when it builds, it has the CPP files for persistence and CPP files for queries, and CPP files for DB core. Okay. So, and when it builds that, then it just uses them, fires the queries in the test.
So in the test class, it should have a reference member of the DB.
Yeah, I think so. I think that would be very reasonable.
And what I mean is, each separate component, like query and persistence, where should their test function be there? This test functions in their own CPP, or they should be written in the test.
I think that query should have a test stub that does construction tests, but it doesn't do these. It does none of these demonstration tests. The test class is responsible for doing all your demonstration tests for the TAs.
And the mean just invokes this.
Just declaring an instance of the query and using the query and say, look at that. Here we did this query. So here's the database before we make the query. Here's what we got from the query. Here's we're editing. That's we're going to be very reasonable. If you've already done a design, I know you've made a lot of progress. If you've already done a design that's different, I'm not mandating that you tear your design all apart. What I'm saying is, what I just described, I think is a very rational way to design it, a good way to design it. But there are other design alternatives, and if you picked another one already and been successful with it, leave it. We're not going to take all points because you didn't do a test class just the way I just described it.
Doesn't matter, I have refactored a lot.
Okay, all right. Well, I think that would be a good, that'll, in a sense, you're almost refactoring by doing that. Yes, the root. It does exactly what my demo did in class on Friday. So on class on Friday, I create a query which gets all the keys from the database. And then I do a select on some condition, and that creates a new key set. And then that select, because it's a member function I query, it takes those new keys and replaces the original keys with those new keys. And now you make another select, and that's using the new keys.
How about from?
From does the same thing. From lets me take keys from a different query. So I can get to a set of keys by doing a whole bunch of queries, get to that set, or I can start out with a query and give it that set of keys. I made some, I did some queries. Yeah, multiple queries are ending of the condition. So give me all the elements that satisfy this condition, and this condition, and this condition, and this condition. They could be all separate queries. From lets me take this query. So I've got this query, I don't want to save it. I don't want to change it again. But now I want to make an additional query on that. So now I can create this new query and say from that query. So I'm not changing that query. I'm changing this query. Okay. So I still have that one, but now I have this one too. That's what from is. I gotta. So you got 4 more minutes. You do. Well, you have a requirement for anding conditions and oring conditions. From is just a nice helper to do that. Okay, that's all. You don't have to do from. I just think it's a nice. I wouldn't have pretended if I didn't think it was a good idea. All right, guys, I think it's time to pack up and make room for the next wave, all 3 of them. Yeah. Guys, let me have your attention. Do not make console menus. I don't want console menus. Remember, we said the TA is going to type compile and then run with their hands behind their back. They're not going to type anything into a console. If you present a console menu, I will take 5 points right off the top. Bam, gone. I despise console menus. So a console will say, open the file. What file? I'll type in foobar and your program will crash. No console menus. I despise them. Thank you. Okay, let's pack up and get out of here so the next wave can come in. Come on, guys, back up and leave so the new guys can find a seat. I had you this Friday, I had you today. Here. I'm gonna go get a cup of coffee. I need it desperately, and then I'll be right back. You were worried about synchronizer, so if you want to do that, that's fine.
对啊，我靠，今天还是这个车。对，你没有看完啊？那我们那车坏了，可以坐。我们原来那个，快快快快快那个黄对啊，校车。对啊，对对对，就那个友好，人家早上那个站。这是吧？因为我们原来那车坏了，然后这个天天换这个。
是很小的吗？很小吗？
对啊，本来我们车就多，本来就不多。你在我在等车的时候，开始傻。哎呦，贴那
Excuse me. Thank you. Okay. Good morning, everybody. If you guys are on your way out, why don't you chat in the hall? Okay, project 1, is that what we want to talk about? You want to talk about project 2? I'd like to talk about project 1. I want to talk about project 1. Okay, who's got questions? Nobody's got questions? It's going to be a really short help session if nobody's got questions. Yes.
Could you explain about how to add the payload structure?
I don't want to talk too much about that. I really don't. You know, I've given a lot of help. I would like you guys to figure it out. You know, I said on the board one time, you know, you could do it as a dot, you know, a struct with, but a class might be better. You know, make the stuff private, provide it, but it doesn't have to be anything complicated. I think I would probably use a class. But, you know, the query mechanism is interesting. How am I going to do that? You know, what you'd like. Certainly for that one structure, you can query it, not a problem. But to set up a query mechanism that'll work for lots of different payloads is an interesting question. You know, basically, I had suggested you could think about making the condition a query on the payload, the condition class, and provide a template member, select member that accepted a T. You know, whether that makes sense to you or not, I don't know. You know, that template member is there to accept functors or lambdas or, you know, function pointers. Those are all different types, so to accept any one of them, you gotta have a template type. And if I have time, my game plan is to implement Project 1 myself, and 2 weeks after this one is due, post it. I won't post it right away because there'll be people who didn't do much and, will go take mine and put their name on it and tweak it in little ways and submit it, and so. If I wait 2 weeks, then, they've lost 14 points off the top. We'll probably see that anyway, and they lose a lot more points, but at the least, they'd lose 14 points, and that, I'm just trying to be fair to everybody else who worked hard on it. Yes?
For requirement 10, it says shall provide in your.
Let me pull up 10 so we can talk about it. For requirement 10. Yeah.
Does this mean we put all our test cases and call test from execute?
So here's my mental model. Here's what I would do. All we're trying to do is force you not to put everything in a one big, huge, fat package that, okay. But I would have an executive, and I would have a separate test, and each one of these guys has test stubs that have nothing to do with this. They're just construction tests, and so the model is, as I'm building my query class, I add a function, I write a test for it, and I don't stop until that works, and then I add another function and write a test, and I keep going incrementally that way. And I do package, so DB core first, and then query second, and then persistence third, or whatever, okay? But now, you have to demonstrate that you meet all the requirements, and for the TAs, but professionally, you need to do the same kind of thing. You need to demonstrate, here's how this thing works. For a design review, for example, or an implementation review. So I would have a separate test class, and I would make the database, the DB core, a reference member of this class, meaning that I have to use I have to have a constructor that accepts the DB by non-const reference, and then in the initialization sequence, it sets that reference class. You can't assign it in the body. That doesn't work because you can't assign to a reference, so you have to do it that way. So this test class has a database reference member, and now each of its methods, its public methods, test some of this, one of these things. So it has this DB, so each method doesn't have to, we don't need the DB provider anymore, okay? Because the DB provider was just there to pass this consistent database that one test started, another test is going to change. Now it's just a member of the class, and they all have access to it as long as their test methods are methods of the class. And so, you'll test this requirement and demonstrate it, and test this requirement and demonstrate it, just with separate methods in the test class. Okay. So the test class, so you have test stubs, and you have the test class, and they're doing totally different things. The test stubs are just construction tests. You don't have to demonstrate anything except to yourself that it works. But, and so who creates the test instance of the test class and runs it? The executive. So the executive's main just says, testing of the database. So it creates a database, and then it creates an instance of test class, and then the executive just calls methods on the test class. So you got a method R3, R4, or demo R3, demo R4, demo R5. So the executive says demo R, says test class, T.demo R3, T.demo R4, T.demo R5. Right? If you've already, made a lot of progress, and have done it in a somewhat different way, that's okay. This is just my model of a good way to do it. Your model, what you do doesn't have to exactly match the model that I have in my head. That's never a requirement, okay? Your requirements are to satisfy these with some reasonable design. And I tell you these things, you know, I'm telling you what I think is a reasonable design, but it's not the only possible reasonable design. You're free to do other things. Right, Gabe?
And the next requirement is that, so saying describing the project's package structure, is that next one we're building outside of the code out our project and submitting it up?
So which requirement are we talking about?
11.
11. So what this is asking you to do is to build a database that has a record for each package in your project and records the dependency relationships of those packages in the relationships. So it's a exercise, you know, it says, is your database strong enough to represent some real situation? Okay. And it lets us see, do you have a reasonable structure? You know, we're going to pull your code up in Visual Studio anyway, and we'll see. But it's a quick view of whether you have a reasonable structure. And when we look at that, we might say, gee, that looks a little funny. I'm going to go look at that particular part in the.
So would we use that same database as like?
I would. What I would do is I would build. You know, you don't want to give the TAs 30 pages of output. So I would build little tiny test databases that have just enough to show. And I probably have one, but I'd be willing to remove elements, add elements, just for this test. So if I have to demonstrate that I can edit something, I would have a database with 2 records. And I'd say, okay, I'm going to edit the first record, and I would edit it, and then I would show that the database with those 2 records to show that my edits were persistent, that they stopped. So I do things like that. So I would build, and you don't have to have separate XML files for each of those. Perfectly okay to build that database on the fly, in memory, just for these tests, and then. Eventually you're going to have to use it to persist stuff. This 11 is all about, now let's use this database to do something real that might look a little bit like what we're going to do in Project 2. Yeah. What's your name? Ready? Duel.
UL.
So a UL.
Yeah.
Cool. UL.
Yeah.
You ask really good questions. You ask really good questions, so keep it up. You're getting a real good reputation in this department. People like you. He's been doing real well in the other courses. He's been doing real, so far, he's asking real good questions. We'll see when we look at your project. But yours will be one of the first ones I grade. Actually, the TAs will grade them, and then I look at them. Some of them I'll go back and grade it myself just because I'm interested. Okay, questions? Be sure it helps session if there aren't any questions, guys. Everybody's all ready. I see some sheepish grins, so. Yes.
So regarding requirement on the augmentation when you upload an XML. So if there's data already existing, what is?
Yeah. So here's the idea. So you need to be able to show that you can persist the whole database. You can persist, You need to show that you can shard by persisting just the results of a query. That's almost the same process, really simple. Now, what we do for this part is when we restore, that means we start with an empty database and we load some file. We get exactly the database that's represented by that file. Exactly. Augmentation means something else. Augmentation means I'm starting with a database that already has some records in it, and now I'm going to augment it with the records in the file. Now, I think I read that file and I get a key. What I would do is I would see if that key is in my database, and if it's not, I would ignore it because it's probably older than what's in my database right now. But if it isn't in my database, then I add it to my database. That's augment. So I'm augmenting the original contents with this new contents, but I'm being very careful not to overwrite stuff that's probably newer. Now, you can provide an option in that process so that either you don't overwrite or you do overwrite. That would be a very rational thing to do. Other questions? We use what? Yeah, but don't hardwire that into you can, but don't make that your design for the database because that may break in project 2. Definitely could. For your demonstrations, you can make the key the same as make the name the same as the key. Perfectly fine. No reason not to. But I think, when you demonstrate the editing, you probably ought to edit the name and demonstrate that you didn't change the key. Okay, because that's forbidden. You're not allowed to edit keys. Because the key is the identifier in the database. And if you edit them, wacka wacka, things go south in a hurry. You don't want to, not only do you not want to, but you want to make sure that nobody else can. Because your design hinges on the thing. Other questions? One interesting thing has to do with the payload. You say, gee, the payload is unspecified type, an arbitrary type. We've specified what it will be for this project. But can I devise a query? This is really what I was talking about with you. Can I devise a query mechanism that will work if it's a different type? And the answer is, with some help of that payload type, yeah. So I could ask the payload type to provide a couple of methods that support querying. And if you provide a template member select, like I showed you in that one help, so here's a select function that takes a T type, and your model is that'll be the payload type, okay. Or maybe not. Actually, probably not, because what you'll want to do is that allows you to put in a lambda or a functor, pass that into that select, and that lambda will determine for that particular select function, not for the other select. The other select function work on conditions, but this select function will just execute that lambda, okay? And now that allows you to be really flexible in the way you got a new payload type, just so you build a new lambda that knows how to deal with that payload type. Right, UL?
What if we do it like this one? Payload type, why don't we have our own get query wherever we are writing?
You could. I think, so that's a normal reaction to say, gee, this is an unspecified type. I want that unspecified type to take care of all these operations. But so the good news is it takes care of all those. The bad news is that now that type has to know a lot about your database. And so my own design sensibility is it would be better if I could use pretty close to my own design, design ideas for the database and not demand that that payload know all that stuff. Payload might have to supply, so I might have to say in my spec, for you to use your own T-type, it has to provide these two methods. Better yet, you'll provide an interface and say the payload types have to implement this interface. Okay, is the right way to do it. But, I don't know what those methods should be. I haven't thought about it a whole lot. Okay. But if I have time, I'm going to implement my own version of Project 2 and post it. I won't post it right. Did I mention that already? I won't post it right away. I'll post it in a couple of weeks. So you can see how I react to it. But your objectives are not to reproduce the design ideas I have in my head. It's not a requirement in this course. Absolutely not. I would rather see originality and invention and, Yes.
So what would be the ideal cyclometric complexity of a function?
Ideal?
Yeah, like when we pass it through.
I like to, so you don't lose points unless it's bigger than 10. But I like to see it around 2 or 3. Cyclomatic complexity measures the number of scopes in a function. We don't pay any attention to cyclomatic complexity and size of classes and namespaces. The analyzer tells you that, and it's useful information. But we only pay attention to cyclomatic complexity and size of functions, individual functions. And it's very difficult to test. If you get to a cyclomatic complexity of 10, writing a solid test for that function is really hard. Got too many things too many possible combinations to test.
Code analyzer.
So, I'm looking on my own machine. Let's pull up College Server. Go to directories 687. Get out of my face. I'm sorry. Code Analyzer EXEs. So it's really this Code Analyzer with GUI exes.zip. That's what you want. So what happens is that will give you this. Yeah, I have it here. That will give you this. And so you just come and you say browse. So let's go to Project 1 Help Spring 18. Let's go to CPU NoSQL-DB. So let's go up to there. And yep. Our analysis. So I'm showing the abstract syntax tree. Let me change the display mode to, I don't want the AST, I want a metrics display. And so start analysis. So it's saying datetime CPP, the constructor is has a cyclomatic complexity of 15, so I would lose a point for that, unless I refactored it. But most of mine, look at the complexities here. Most of them are 1, 1, 1, 2, 4, here's a 7. And normally, when I see that, my inclination is to go refactor a little bit to make it easier to test, okay? But that's how that's what you want, okay? What's your name?
Neha.
Sneha. Sneha.
Yeah.
What's your last name? Shankar? Yeah. Oh, Sneha Shankar. I have to ask you about 7 times before I remember. UL I'll probably remember because it's a nice short name, it's unusual. But I've had lots of Snehas and I've had a few Sankars, so it may take me a little while to remember your name, but I'll try. Other questions?
If we use your code, the author should be.
So good question. So if you use my code, which you're welcome to, here's what you do. If you change a single character in that code, just one character, you become the author and you list me as the source. If that doesn't happen, if you leave my name as the author, I will get people coming back and said, I looked at this piece of code from that project and it's full of bugs. It's lousy code. Why did you write this awful code? What are you doing handing out that code? Okay? That's not fair. Okay? I didn't insert all those bugs. So if you change a single character, your obligation is to list yourself as the author and me as the source. You give me credit, as you should anybody. If you use some code from, don't use code from the web. You're not supposed to for this class. But, if you're working professionally and you find on Stack Overflow a nice piece of code, and you use it, give them credit. You list yourself as the author and you say the source is URL, C, whatever the guy's name is. If we detect that you used my code, changed it, and left my name on it, we'll deduct points. 1 point. Unless it's full of bugs. Then more. Okay? Other questions? You are always welcome to use code from the college server, from my directories. I would strongly recommend that you largely limit yourselves to the things that are in the Project 1 Help Spring 18, and there will be a Project 2 Help Spring 18, and so on. There may be a Project 2 Help Spring 18 sometime this weekend. And the SU repository. But the problem is, I've got lots of code all over the place, and there's some duplications, and I have a real hard time with configuration management. I'm lousy at configuration management. You'd think I'd be much better because, I worked in industry for a long time, and I use good configuration management tools. But anyway, so to avoid getting stuff that's out of date, the one thing I guarantee is that the Project 1 or 2 or whatever help Spring 18 will be up to date. I make sure that the code there stays up to date. Other questions? Do I go back to my office? You all done? Good, you guys are in great shape. Glad to hear that you're all ready. You don't look too happy. Are you all ready?
Somewhat.
A little bit. So I'm a little bit already. That's kind of a contradiction in terms. So, you making progress?
Yes.
Okay. That's what I want to hear. Yes, I'm making progress. Yes, I know where I'm going. Yes, I got some questions. Yes. You're pounding, including CPP files? Don't do that. So repeat your question again? You don't want to do that. That isn't a great design. So here's what will happen. So the statement was, I wrote the query class and the persistence class in DB core. Is that a good design? And the answer is no. You want to satisfy the single responsibility principle. So DB core is responsible for managing that data, period. Query is responsible for extracting information from the database, period. Persistence is responsible for